A lone vehicle cruised down a dimly lit highway, its tires humming against the asphalt as the cool night air whispered past. Inside, James Cooper sat with an unwavering gaze, his hands firm on the wheel. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a path he had traveled many times before, but tonight, something felt different. His instincts, sharpened by years of military service, kept him alert. Without warning, flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness behind him. A deep sigh escaped his lips as he eased his car to a stop at the side of the road. The officer approaching his vehicle carried an air of authority, but there was something else, something James immediately recognized. It was not just routine protocol. It was an intent driven by something deeper. License and registration, the officer demanded, his voice clipped. James complied without hesitation, handing over his documents while keeping his expression neutral. He had faced situations far more intense than a simple traffic stop, but this was not just about a citation. The officer, Henderson, as his badge indicated, took an unnecessarily long time inspecting the documents, his eyes darting toward the back seat. "What is in the safe?" Henderson asked, his tone shifting from professional to prying. James's jaw tightened. The metallic safe, securely placed behind him, was none of Henderson's business. "Just personal belongings," he replied evenly. Henderson narrowed his eyes, stepping back slightly as if contemplating his next move. "Step out of the vehicle." James exhaled slowly. He knew where this was heading. He had seen this kind of abuse of power before, an officer flexing authority without just cause. Yet he complied, exiting the car with a steady composure. Henderson walked toward the safe, his fingers itching to pry it open. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. "I do mind," James responded firmly. "You have no warrant." A tense silence stretched between them. Henderson's stare bore into James, but James did not flinch. He had spent years serving his country, protecting its values. He was not about to let someone trample over his rights without a fight. The moment hung in the air, charged and unyielding. Henderson's fingers twitched toward his belt. "Are you hiding something, Cooper?" James held his ground, his voice calm but unwavering. "The law does not operate on suspicion alone, officer. If you want to open that safe, get a warrant." The challenge in his voice was unmistakable, and in that instant, James knew this was only the beginning. A flicker of frustration passed over Henderson's face. His grip on his belt tightened, but James remained still, his posture unshaken. The tension in the air was palpable. "You think you are above questioning, Cooper?" Henderson sneered, stepping closer, his authority pressing down like a weight. James met his gaze without fear. "I think I know my rights," he replied. Henderson exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. He took a step back and spoke into his radio. "Dispatch, I have a situation here. Suspect carrying an unidentified locked container. Requesting backup." James clenched his jaw. Suspect, the word was deliberate, designed to escalate. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, red and blue lights bouncing off the darkened highway. A second officer, younger but just as rigid in posture, stepped out. Henderson turned to him and nodded toward the safe. "This man refuses to let us inspect that box," he stated, voice laced with insinuation. The younger officer looked at James, hesitant. "Do we have probable cause?" Henderson's lips pressed into a thin line. His refusal raises suspicion. James let out a dry chuckle. "Since when is knowing your rights a reason for suspicion?" The young officer faltered. He could sense the fine line they were walking. Henderson, however, was unrelenting. "Listen here, Cooper," he said, voice dropping to a near growl. "I can have this car towed, hold you for obstruction, and open that safe anyway. So, unless you want this to get ugly, I suggest you cooperate." James inhaled deeply, forcing himself to stay composed. He had faced men like Henderson before, men who believed their badge placed them above the law. He knew their type, and he knew giving it would only justify their abuse. "You do not have the authority to open that safe without a warrant," James said, his voice steady. "If you do, you will be violating the law. And trust me, officer, this will not end well for you." Henderson's jaw ticked, his authority being challenged in front of his colleague. For a moment, The night was filled only with the hum of the engines and the distant chirping of crickets. Then, as if unable to tolerate the resistance any longer, Henderson made his move. Without warning, he reached for the safe. James reacted instantly, shifting his stance. His instincts screamed against letting this happen. But before he could respond, another voice cut through the night. "Step away from that safe." A powerful presence emerged from the darkness, his figure illuminated by the flashing lights. "David." James exhaled in relief. His old friend had arrived just in time. Henderson's body stiffened as he turned toward the source of the voice. The authority in David's tone was unmistakable. He wasn't just another bystander. He was a man who carried weight in his presence alone. James watched as Henderson's confidence wavered for the first time that night. David stepped forward, his stance unwavering. His piercing gaze locked onto Henderson, assessing him like a predator, sizing up its prey. "Do you even realize what you are about to do?" he asked, his voice sharp. Henderson squared his shoulders, attempting to reclaim control. This man is refusing to comply. He is carrying an unidentified safe, and he is acting suspiciously. "I have every right to inspect it." David let out a humorless chuckle. "Suspiciously? Or are you just mad that he knows the law better than you do?" Henderson's jaw clenched. His authority was being questioned, and he did not like it. The younger officer, sensing the rising tension, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," the younger officer interjected hesitantly, looking at David. "And you are?" David pulled out his identification and handed it over. "David Lawson, former military intelligence." A flicker of recognition crossed the young officer's face. He glanced at Henderson uncertainly, but Henderson refused to acknowledge it. David turned back to James, then back to Henderson. "Now, unless you have a warrant, you have no legal grounds to touch that safe. And we both know it." Henderson's nostrils flared. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. His pride would not let him back down so easily. James crossed his arms, watching as the power struggle unfolded. He could see Henderson weighing his options, trying to determine whether pushing forward was worth the risk. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Maybe we should." "I do not need a warrant if I suspect criminal activity," Henderson interrupted, his voice tight. He turned his sharp glare back to James. "If you have nothing to hide, why not let us open it?" James did not flinch. "Because my rights are not up for debate, officer. That is the difference between the law and your ego." A muscle twitched in Henderson's jaw. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken tension. David took another step forward, his voice lowering. "You are walking a dangerous line, officer. I would think carefully before taking another step." The way David said it was not a threat. It was a warning. James knew Henderson could feel it too. For the first time that night, real hesitation flickered across Henderson's face. He was still fuming, still itching for control, but now uncertainty was creeping in. The younger officer took a small step back, sensing that this confrontation was escalating beyond his control. James could see the inner battle playing out in Henderson's mind. He had come into this situation believing he was in control. But now, he was the one being cornered. Henderson took a slow breath. He was not ready to back down, but he was also starting to realize he might not have a choice. David did not move. James did not move. They were waiting to see what Henderson would do next. And Henderson knew, whatever choice he made now would change everything. A tense silence stretched between them, the weight of the moment pressing down on Henderson. His pride screamed at him to act, to seize control, but a sliver of doubt had begun to creep into his mind. James stood unwavering, his expression unreadable, while David remained a looming presence beside him. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them, clearly realizing that this situation was no longer in their favor. Henderson finally exhaled sharply, his jaw clenched. "Fine," he spat. "You want to do this the hard way? We will see how that works out for you." But before anyone could react, he lunged forward, reaching for the safe. James was faster. In a swift motion, he stepped aside, causing Henderson to stumble. The younger officer instinctively reached out, but David's voice cut through the chaos. "Stand down." The authority in his voice was undeniable, and for a brief moment, everyone froze. Henderson recovered quickly, spinning to face James, his expression twisted with frustration. "You are making a mistake," he growled. James did not blink. "No, you are." With measured movements, James placed a firm hand on the safe. "You have already crossed too many lines tonight, officer. But I promise you, if you take one more step in the wrong direction, you will regret it." Henderson's face turned red with anger, but something in James's tone gave him pause. David stepped forward, his stance calm but commanding. "Let me make this clear," he said, his voice controlled. "If you violate this man's rights any further, you will not just be dealing with him. You will be dealing with the full weight of the law." Henderson's hands curled into fists at his sides. He looked at James, then at David, then at the safe. He was outnumbered, not in bodies but in power, and he hated it. The younger officer, sensing the shift, took another step back. James took a slow breath before speaking again. "You have already humiliated yourself enough for one night. Walk away before you make it worse." Henderson's eyes flickered with pure rage, but deep down, he knew the truth. He had lost control of the situation. He let out a bitter chuckle. "This is not over," he muttered under his breath. And with that, he turned sharply on his heel and stormed back toward his patrol car. The younger officer hesitated for a moment, then followed. James and David stood still, watching him go. Only when the squad car pulled away did David finally exhale. He turned to James with a smirk. "Well, that was eventful." James shook his head, his grip tightening around the safe. "Something tells me this is far from over." David nodded, his expression growing serious. "Yeah, and if I were you, I would be ready for whatever comes next." James glanced down at the safe, the weight of it suddenly feeling heavier in his hands. He had no doubt Henderson would be back, and next time he might not come alone. Henderson marched back to his squad car, his face still streaked with the green paint that had humiliated him in front of everyone. He rubbed at it furiously, but the stains refused to come off completely, much like the disgrace of his actions tonight. As he scrubbed his face in frustration, his anger only grew. He had lost control, lost authority, and worst of all, he had lost in front of James Cooper. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the car door, staring at his reflection in the side mirror. The eyes that stared back at him were filled with rage, confusion, and something else. Fear. Because for the first time, Henderson realized just how badly he had miscalculated. James had proof of everything: the confrontation, the threats, the illegal attempt to access the safe. And now, standing in the dark, Henderson felt the weight of reality crashing down on him. He had invaded private property. He had violated protocol. He had made himself vulnerable to charges that could ruin him. And James? James was still standing tall, calm and composed, as if he had already won. Henderson gritted his teeth, shooting a final glare toward James, but there was no defiance left in his posture, just silent acceptance of his mistake. James watched him with an unwavering gaze. "You are out of options," he said, his voice steady. "You can either walk away or face the consequences. But know this: I will not let you get away with what you have done." Henderson's lips parted, as if searching for a last-ditch argument, but nothing came. He had nothing left to say. Slowly, he turned back toward his car. His boots felt heavier with every step. When he finally reached the door, he hesitated for just a second before pulling it open and sliding inside. Without another word, he started the engine and drove off into the night. But James knew this was not over. David exhaled sharply beside him. "That man is dangerous," he muttered. James nodded, still gripping the folder of documents he had retrieved from the safe. The pages rustled in the night breeze, revealing official seals and classified markings. "They are not just ordinary papers," James said, his voice quiet but firm. "These documents are connected to a military operation, something Henderson had no business interfering with." David's eyes darkened. "Then we need to make sure he does not get another chance." James nodded, his grip tightening. "I will make sure he faces the consequences for what he did tonight." The weight of the situation settled between them. For Henderson, tonight had been an embarrassment. For James, it had been a warning. A war was brewing, and the battle had only just begun. Henderson's downfall was swift and merciless. Public humiliation was one thing, but the real nightmare had only just begun. His actions were now under intense scrutiny, and every step he took felt like walking on shattered glass. His colleagues no longer greeted him with nods of respect. Instead, they whispered behind his back, their eyes filled with quiet disdain. His commanding officers barely acknowledged his presence, their disappointment louder than any reprimand. But the worst part? The investigation was no longer just an internal matter. Henderson was being dragged into a courtroom, his career, his reputation, and his future hanging by a thread. A week later, the trial began. The entire city was watching. The courtroom was packed with journalists, community activists, and everyday citizens who wanted to see if justice would truly be served. The viral footage of Henderson's paint-covered humiliation had cemented him as the symbol of reckless law enforcement, and now, people demanded accountability. When he entered the courtroom, all eyes locked onto him. Gone was the arrogant officer who had once acted with impunity. Now, he looked worn, his face gaunt from sleepless nights, his eyes clouded with anxiety. The once feared officer was nothing more than a disgraced man trying to salvage what little dignity he had left. But there was no salvaging this. Not today. James Cooper took the stand, his presence steady and composed. In a measured tone, he recounted everything, from the moment he was stopped on the highway to the unlawful attempt to open his safe. Every detail was laid out with precision. Every action by Henderson was exposed. And then the evidence was presented. Video footage played on a large screen, displaying Henderson's recklessness in full clarity. The sight of him attempting to scrub paint from his face, his uniform splattered in green, sent ripples of hushed laughter through the room. Even the judge's expression remained unreadable as the footage ended. Henderson's lawyers tried to justify his actions, claiming that he had acted out of suspicion and that his intent had not been malicious. But intent was not enough. The law did not bend for excuses. The prosecution dismantled every argument, pointing out that Henderson had no legal authority to access James's property, let alone force open the safe. His reckless abuse of power had violated fundamental rights, and that was something the court could not ignore. Then, during the closing statements, James spoke again. His voice was steady, but his emotions ran deep. When those entrusted with enforcing the law begin to believe they are above it, the entire system collapses, he said, his gaze locking onto Henderson. No one should have to fear that their rights can be ignored simply because someone in power decides they are inconvenient. A heavy silence followed his words. And then, the judge delivered the verdict. Henderson was permanently dismissed from the police force. His suspension was no longer temporary. It was a final, crushing blow to his career. Additionally, he was sentenced to probation for abuse of power and the violation of privacy. He was ordered to compensate James for the invasion of his personal property, as well as the emotional distress caused by the ordeal. But that was not all. He was also required to complete a mandatory ethics and law enforcement training program. A bitter humiliation for a man who once thought himself untouchable. And as if that was not enough, an independent investigation into Henderson's past cases was announced, ensuring that if there were more skeletons in his closet, they would be found. The fallout was brutal. News of Henderson's disgrace spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with commentary, the viral paintball footage resurfacing with every new discussion. Memes flooded the internet, mocking his arrogance and downfall. His name became a cautionary tale, an example of unchecked power meeting its reckoning. Meanwhile, James Cooper quietly returned to his life, his dignity intact, his rights upheld. Though the ordeal had left its mark, he had no regrets. He had stood his ground, and in doing so, he had reminded the world that justice still mattered. Hashtag, do you believe justice was served? This story is not just about one man's fight for his rights. It is about standing up against injustice, no matter who is responsible. When power is abused, it is up to us to demand accountability. Do you think Henderson got what he deserved? Or do you believe the punishment should have been harsher? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that justice must always prevail, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories like this one. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.